Well, thanks. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate you guys inviting me. So I've been asked to basically talk about the relationship between guns and crime. You know, if there's probably one issue that kind of separates libertarian types more than anything else, is probably gun control type issues. You know, the question is, do you trust individuals or do you trust the government? Whether you trust somebody with weapons is kind of the ultimate for whether you trust individuals to make decisions or not. Now, I suppose a lot of you get your impressions about what the United States is like from television shows. And I just want to start off with a short video here just to kind of give you an idea of kind of the misimpressions you may be getting from the media. Well, they like them in shoot-'em-up movies. But as soon as it comes to a good civilian using a gun for self-defense, Hollywood turns anti-gun.
She shot herself.
Why the gun though?
Hollywood constantly portrays people who hate guns.
I'm not a huge fan of weapons. Now do you see why I don't like guns? You don't like guns either.
I'm not a big fan of guns. I don't like it.
Why'd I leave the FBI? Guns, man.
It's almost as if they're trying to condition people to hate guns. In Hollywood, even Navy SEALs warn against owning guns.
I need a gun to protect the kids when you're not around.
You'd be dangerous to yourself and to the kids.
The wise law enforcement experts constantly urge people not to use
But
them.
in my experience, the problem with carrying a gun is that eventually it will go off.
But Hollywood gets this backwards. In real life, police strongly support civilians owning guns and carrying them for self-defense. A recent survey by the National Association of Chiefs of Police polled thousands of sheriffs and chiefs of police. 76% believe that qualified, law-abiding armed citizens help law enforcement reduce violent criminal activity. Detroit's police chief urges people to carry guns.
So good Americans who are responsible with concealed weapons can make a difference.
He became chief and encouraged civilians to carry guns 6 years ago. Detroit's murder rate fell since then.
I'm excited about our trend downward.
Nationwide, rank-and-file cops show even stronger support for private gun ownership than do police chiefs. More than 90% supported civilians carrying guns. No surprise, Hollywood's cops are wrong, and real-life cops are right. Police are informed by what they see on the street every day. They know how important having a gun is to their own safety, and they know that private citizens can help.
We've seen our good Samaritans. We've seen them go to the aid to others because they were good Americans with concealed weapons permits.
Many Hollywood crime show writers clearly know nothing about guns and crime. The myths they push on people are endless.
What else do we know about these guns?
This was the machine gun that Davis was firing at us, the so-called cop killer.
Stop. Since 1934, there are only 2 known uses ever of a machine gun being used in a murder. Yet Hollywood shows criminals using machine guns to outgun cops all the time. Hollywood also finds endless ways to insult civilians who are using guns.
No good's gonna come from you guys running around here with assault rifles. We're prisoners on the loose. We got a right to protect our neighborhood.
Yeah, that's a job for law enforcement, not a ragtag militia.
Hollywood plays to bigoted stereotypes, depicting gun owners as dumb hicks.
Got what? Got a fugitive. Hey, get off me. Now they do anything. Officers, please. Hey, let him go. That's not who we're looking for. I kept telling him that. You sure? He looks guilty as hell to me. At least check his papers.
Let him go.
In real life, citizen volunteers and neighborhood watch programs save lives. A 2008 U.S. Justice Department analysis found that crime fell 16% in areas that started a neighborhood watch program compared to those that did not. Some of Hollywood's bias is comical. In this show, a woman asks a federal agent if he's worried about not having his gun in a gun-free zone when he's facing professional killers.
You sure about this no guns thing?
Bad guys won't have them either.
Bad guys won't have them either? Seriously? Has a bad guy ever seen a no guns allowed sign and turned around? In the show, the killers obey the signs and leave their guns behind. But in real life, gun-free zones only encourage criminals. They serve as a magnet for criminals. Virtually all the mass public shootings in the United States since 1950 have occurred in places where general citizens are banned from having guns.
The Virginia Beach shooting this year was another example of this. A woman who worked at the municipal office building talked with her husband the night before the attack about bringing her permanent concealed handgun to work for self-defense. But she decided not to because of a city rule against carrying guns. She and 11 others were killed the next day by a disgruntled coworker. In another recent case, a doctor carried a gun anyway, despite his hospital's no-gun policy, and he stopped a mass public shooting. As the district attorney put it, if the doctor did not have a firearm, he'd be dead today. And I believe that other people in that facility would also be dead. That real-life situation would make a gripping TV story, but don't expect to see it. Hollywood bias is everywhere, and it endangers lives by misleading people on guns.
Okay, so much of the views that people have are affected by what we see on television. And, you know, if you look over at least the last 5 years, we haven't tried to go much systematically before that. It's really difficult. We haven't been able to find a single entertainment TV show where somebody successfully, a regular citizen, successfully uses a gun to protect themselves or their families. What ends up happening all the time is that instead something goes wrong. Either they shoot themselves or a loved one, or, you know, it just doesn't work out right. But it's not just entertainment television shows where you see this bias. In the news, you see this constantly. So, I mean, how many of you have heard of Parkland school shooting? My guess is virtually everybody probably has. Now, there was an attack just a few months later, right near there in Florida, in Titusville. How many people heard of that school shooting? My guess is almost no one. And then the difference between the two is that in the Titusville one, there was a citizen with a permanent concealed handgun who stopped the attack before anybody was killed or wounded. There was, you look at the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2017. 49 people were murdered in that attack. That's the second worst mass public shooting in U.S. history. My guess is probably most of you have heard of it, or at least a lot of you heard about it at the time. What about the Lyman nightclub shooting that occurred a week later in South Carolina? My guess is none of you have heard about it because it only got local news coverage. The Titusville one also only got local news coverage. Didn't get any national news coverage in the United States, didn't get any coverage in the rest of the world. What was the difference between the two? Florida was one of 10 states that banned people with permanent concealed handguns to carry their guns in places that served alcohol, that got more than 50% of their revenue from alcohol. South Carolina was one of the 40 states that allowed it. The person tried to do a similar attack, pulled out his gun, started shooting people, shot 3 people, and before he could shoot a 4th person, a person with a permanent concealed handgun pulled out their gun and stopped the attack. Again, it only got local news coverage. You know, there are literally dozens of these types of cases, and you can go to our website at crimeresearch.org, where we've put together in just the last few years where citizens have stopped what otherwise would have been mass public shootings. But these cases rarely get national news coverage. In fact, over the last 5 years, I can only think of 2 cases that have gotten any type of national news coverage. Now, both the Parkland and Pulse nightclub shootings, as well as the other ones you probably can recall, had something in common that the Titusville and Lyman nightclub shootings didn't. And that is, they occurred in places where general citizens were banned from being able to have guns. 94% of the mass public shootings in the United States take place in those areas where guns are banned. These killers may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. Their goal is to go and kill as many people as possible. Where do you go then? If you want to be successful, you go to a place where people can't defend themselves. You're going to be able to go and kill more people if some people can't defend themselves. Now, you may have a police officer at a school, what have you, but the thing is, having a person in uniform stopping one of these mass public shootings is an almost impossible job. Having somebody in uniform is like putting somebody there with a neon sign that says, "Shoot me first." If you're a killer and you're going to go and do these attacks, you have a huge strategic advantage. You're going to one of the options is to kill the officer first, or you can wait for them to leave the scene, or you can pick another target. We have 600,000 police officers in the United States. Maybe 250,000 at maximum are on duty at any point in time. We have almost 330 million people. That's one police officer for well over 1,000 people. It's simply impossible for police to go and protect people, cover all possible targets that could occur there. And as I say, it's a very dangerous job. If you're going to have an attack, it's almost impossible for the officer to stop it. Here's something I'd like you to think about. Can you name me one place in the world, any place, where either all guns have been banned or all handguns have been banned and murder rates go down? Because I can't find it. I mean, you'd think out of randomness, with all the places that have banned guns, out of randomness, there'd at least be one place where murder rates fell, or at least stayed the same. So I'll just go through a couple places for the United States first. We've tried this in the United States. Washington, D.C., for example, had a handgun ban that went into effect in February 1977. There are different ways you can measure it. This graph tries to look at the murder rate in Washington, D.C. relative to the average for the other cities in the top 50 in terms of size. Prior to the handgun ban, D.C.'s murder rate was about 40% above the average for the other cities. It fell until it got to be about 17%. The ban went into effect, it went back up, and by the time you get 13 years out, it was 80% higher. After that, it went up even more. How about Chicago? Chicago's handgun ban went into effect in November 1982. This data shows Chicago's murder rate relative to the murder rate in the 10 other largest cities. Its murder rate was originally about 70% above. In the years prior, it was falling until it got to be a little bit below the average in the other cities. And then afterwards, after the ban went into effect, it gradually went up. Now, gun control advocates will go and tell you, well, it really wasn't a fair test to have either the Washington, D.C. or the Chicago bans, because they would say, unless you ban guns every place in the country, criminals could still get guns from the rest of Illinois or Indiana, or they could get it from Maryland or Virginia. The thing is, that doesn't really explain why the murder rates went up. It may explain why it didn't fall the way that they were promising it was going to do, but people could have gotten those guns from those other places to begin with. And anyway, if they really thought it was an unfair test, it would have been nice if they had kind of let us in a little bit before they enacted the laws, that they thought that the murder rates were going to be going up. But the thing is, you just don't have to look at the United States. There are whole countries that have banned guns. And in fact, I'm going to show you right now evidence from island nations, which you think would be the ideal experiment. If you think guns are bad, then shouldn't banning guns lower murder rates? Shouldn't it make people safer if you think on net that's the case? So here's Ireland's murder rate. This is for the Republic of Ireland. This is the years prior to their gun ban going into effect in January 72. You can see immediate increase in murder rates. Now, there's a lot of drug gang problems that they have, particularly over here. But even if you take that out, the murder rate was much higher after the ban than it was beforehand. Here's Jamaica. Jamaica's murder rate prior to 1975, when their gun ban went into effect, was virtually identical to the murder rate in the United States. After their ban went into effect, it immediately started going up. Now, there's political violence that occurred here, and again, there's a lot of drug gang violence that occurred over here. But even if you take those out, you're still going to get a much higher rate of murders than you had before the ban went into effect. And in any case, you have to ask yourself, how likely are you going to be able to take guns away from drug gangs? In the United States, we've spent huge amounts of effort to try to keep illegal drugs from gangs being able to get them. And we haven't been very successful. But it's not, what you have to understand is that drug gangs, drug dealers, are the major source of illegal guns in the United States. It's not like a drug dealer can go to the police and say, look, this other gang stole our drugs, can you help us get them back? They have to set up their own little military in order to protect that extremely valuable property it had. If I could click my fingers and cause all illegal drugs in the United States to disappear and all guns, how long do you think it would be before illegal drugs started coming back into the United States? If you're in a southern city like El Paso on the Mexican border, maybe 20 minutes. And how long before they start bringing in the weapons to go and protect that valuable property? They bring them in at the same time because they don't want somebody to go and steal that incredibly valuable property that they have. You know, you have a country like Mexico. Mexico, less than 1% of the adult population in Mexico is legally licensed to own a gun. Mexico has a murder rate 6 times higher than what we have here in the United States. They've only had 1 gun store in Mexico since 1972. So here's for the UK, for England and Wales anyway. You can see the homicide rate up until January 97 when their handgun ban went into effect. Their homicide rate then soared for the next 8 years. Now, one can go and argue this is a little bit inflated right here at the top because there was one big mass murderer that they caught at that time. But even if you eliminated it, it'd still be down around here. It was going up and then it started falling and went back to where it was before. Why did it fall after that? Well, there's actually a pretty simple explanation. People were pretty upset with the high violent crime rates, and within a 2-year period of time, you had a 14% increase in the number of police. Coincides perfectly with the drop that you had afterwards. But even with that huge increase in the number of police, it still only brought it back down to where it was about before the ban went into effect. So why is it that every single time, again, you'd think out of randomness, you get one time where it at least stayed the same. Why is it every single time guns are banned that murder rates go up? Well, there's actually a pretty simple explanation for that, and the question is, who's most likely to obey the law? If it's the most law-abiding good citizens who obey the law, not the criminals, then you have to worry about the fact that you actually make it easier for criminals to go and commit crimes because they don't have to worry about victims being able to go and defend themselves. Look, just as more police make it riskier for criminals to go and commit crime, the fact that a victim might be able to defend themselves also makes it riskier for criminals to go and commit crimes. So, and this point isn't just applicable to bans. Any type of gun control regulation, you have to ask yourself, who's most likely to obey the law? Who's most likely to be disarmed as a result of that? Now, one thing I thought I'd talk a little bit about that you may not be too familiar with is the concealed carry laws that we have in the United States. Right now, all the states in the United States, to varying degrees, allow people to carry concealed handguns. Last year, there's almost 19 million Americans that had a concealed carry permit. That's up over 300% from the 4.6 million in 2007. And that's actually an underestimate of the number of people who legally carry guns in the United States. And the reason is that because in 17 states now, in all or virtually all the state, you no longer even need to have a permit to be able to carry. Those are so-called constitutional carry states. So that's over 7.3% of the adult population. If you kind of remove California and New York, which are the most restrictive, it's almost 9% of the adult population. So you go to a restaurant in the United States, you go to a movie theater, you go to a grocery store, you go to a mall, it's very likely that you're going to have somebody next to you who's carrying a permanent concealed handgun, but you would never know it. There are 4 states now where you have over 1 million concealed carry permit holders: Florida, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Texas. Florida now has the first state with over 2 million permit holders. In Pennsylvania, you have over 14% of the adult population with a permit. Now, the thing is, if my research convinces me of anything, it's that there are 2 groups of people who benefit the most from having guns, and they tend to be the most vulnerable people in our society. One group are the people who are most likely victims of violent crime. That overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high-crime urban areas. It'd be great if the police were there all the time, but police themselves, even though they are extremely important in stopping crime, understand themselves that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's occurred. And so that raises a question: what's the safest course of action for somebody to take when they're confronted by a criminal? The other group of people that my research convinces me benefits the most are the people who are relatively weaker physically, and that it tends to be women and the elderly. you're almost always talking about young male criminals doing the attack. And when a male is attacking a female, there's a larger strength difference that exists there on average than when a man's attacking another man. And the presence of a gun represents a much bigger relative change in a woman's ability to go and defend herself. And interestingly, over the last 7 years that we have data for at least some of the states where it breaks it down by gender and race, we now have about 27% of permit holders in the United States are women, and they've been increasing much faster than men. Between 2012 and 2019, the rate of permits for women has grown about 100% faster than the growth rate for men. And for blacks, it's also increased about 20% faster than for whites. This graph here just gives you some rough idea of how permits have changed over time. In 2019, about 1.9% of adults had a concealed carry permit. Now it's about 7.3%. It's actually been increasing at an increasing rate. Murder rates kind of been bouncing around, but there's been a general downward trend over time at the same time. And the same thing with violent crime. Now, what is a lot more convincing than this is if I were to break it down by individual states, you find that the states that have had the biggest increases in the percent of the adult population with permits have seen the biggest relative drops in violent crime. But it's even more than that. You care not only about the percent, but you also care about the composition. The states that make it easier for people to get permits, having lower fees, have more poor people, more minorities carrying, and those are the states that you see relative bigger drops, because it's not just the number who carry, but if it's the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime are the ones who are carrying, you see the greatest deterrence for criminals. Now, one of the concerns is, well, what about the behavior of permit holders? Well, we have a lot of data across different states. I'll just give you an example for Texas here, of the rate that permit holders get into trouble. And what you find is that they tend to be extremely law-abiding. They lose their permits for any reason at tenths or hundredths of 1%. They lose their permits for any type of firearms-related violation at thousands or tens of thousands of 1%. Police are rarely convicted of misdemeanors or felonies. Police are convicted of misdemeanors or felonies at about 1/20th the rate of the general population. There's some data in Police Quarterly. You can see here police were convicted of misdemeanors and felonies about 1/10 of 1%. Texas permit holders are convicted about 1/100th of 1%. So that's a difference of tenfold that you have there. And it's just similar for other states. Now, what I want to try to talk a minute about is making some international comparisons. And I don't think most academics like to make what we call purely cross-sectional comparisons, but it's the type of thing you see all the time in the media. You know, they'll go and say which states have the most guns and which ones have the highest murder rates. I'll give you a typical example. A lot of people will say, look, the United States has a lot of guns. Compare it to the UK, where it's very restrictive. UK has a low homicide rate. Must be the fact that they have few guns and very strict gun control that causes it. What I would point out, if you look before they had the gun regulations, it was actually even lower relative to the United States than it was after. So, you know, you want to look over time and compare how it's changing relative to other places. But I'm going to spend a minute just looking at the purely cross-sectional comparisons that we see. I'll just show you a couple graphs here. This is usually the type of thing you'll see. This is homicides by firearms per 1 million people. The United States is in red there. It's about 30. And then they have Switzerland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Canada. So this is from Vox. This is from the New York Times. Here they have 11 countries that they compare. This is per 100,000. The United States is in red at 3 per 100,000. Then you have Italy, Canada, Sweden, and so on. Here's a question. How do you pick 11 countries to go and make a comparison with, or 14 countries? Even if you're going to limit yourself to, quote, developed countries, if you take something like the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, they list 36 countries that meet their definition of what a developed country is. the UN. You could go and use their definition of what a developed country is too. And it's going to give you a lot more countries than either 11 or 14. I'm just going to show you a graph here looking at homicide rates across all countries, and then we'll look at developed countries for a minute. So the average, so this is for all countries, this is from 2011. The average is here. The median is here, so half the countries are higher and half are lower, and then the United States is here in red. Now, there are a few points to make here that makes the United States look even relatively higher than it is, and that is, while almost all the countries report the data, not all do, and in fact, it's good reason to believe that the few that don't have even higher homicide rates, it's maybe one reason why they don't report it. The other thing is, this data is from the United Nations, and the United Nations just takes any country's word for it, what their homicide rates are. And there's good reasons to believe a lot of countries aren't very honest in terms of their crime data. I'll just give you one example. Look at Venezuela. According to Venezuela, their official homicide rate is like 65 homicides per 100 people. But their private non-government organizations that have gone there and simply counted news stories, and they estimate that the homicide rate is probably at least 100 per 100,000. But there's good reasons to believe that even that is an underestimate. And the reason why it is because the government does a lot of things in order to suppress news coverage. If you have a relative who's died and you try to go to the media to talk about it, they will not release the body of the deceased relative for you for burial. And there's so many homicides that occur, the media simply doesn't cover a lot of the deaths that occur. There are other things to take into account. A lot of people seem to think that murders and homicides are the same. They're not. Homicides are murders plus justifiable homicides. Now, why should that matter? In the United States, there's good reason to believe that we have a lot more justifiable homicides than in other countries. It's never really been obvious to me why you want to lump together a case where, let's say, a woman shoots a serial rapist who breaks into her home at 2 o'clock in the morning, as well as being the same as, let's say, a robber who in the course of the robbery goes and kills his victim that are there. Those are very different cases. One could even argue that the woman killing the serial rapist was a good thing, but lumping them together makes them both seem like they're bad. And the United States is relatively unique, it appears, in terms of justifiable homicides. But the problem is that there are very few countries that report murder data. They report homicide data. My guess is if I could go and have this in terms of murder rates, so if I were to just take the data for the Centers for Disease Control on homicides and the FBI data on murders, there's actually over a 20% difference between those two numbers, and the United States would probably be down over here someplace. So that's only one out of many reasons that I could go through for why these numbers probably make the United States look worse than it is. How about firearm homicides? Well, this looks very different. The United States is way up. Here's the average. The United States is way up over here in terms of green. And then you have the median. Half the countries are above and half below. Why is the United States so much worse in terms of firearm homicides than we are in terms of overall homicides? Well, there's actually a very simple explanation for it. If you look at these two graphs, you notice anything different? The lines are a lot thinner. It's even harder to read the words. It doesn't really matter what the names of the individual countries are here. The problem is you have almost half the countries in the world don't report firearm homicide data. And what countries don't you think report them? The countries with the high homicide rates. So if you had a situation where, let's say, the United States had been right in the middle in terms of homicides, and the top half of the countries didn't report firearm homicides, they could maybe make it look like the United States was number one in terms of firearm homicides. But it'd be a completely meaningless number because a lot of those countries that had high homicide rates also had high firearm homicide rates. And you can see for developed countries, this is for all 36 countries that are classified by the OECD. You have countries like Brazil and Russia, which have had higher rates. Russia's come down. Recently, Chile has been, at this time, the same as the United States. But even, there are other issues I could go into here, but I'll skip those for time. So how about gun ownership? What the people use all the time in terms of gun ownership is something from the Small Arms Survey. And basically they say the United States is about 89 guns per 100 people. You can see the same set of countries as from the New York Times that I was showing in terms of firearm homicides. The thing is, these numbers are very suspect. If you go through the Small Arms Survey data, you'll find that they actually only provide references for 25 of the 209 countries that they say they have data for. And there are huge differences. I'll give you one simple example. Switzerland and Israel, they look at all these countries, it's gun ownership, not gun possession. When this survey was done, all able-bodied males in Switzerland were mandated to have a machine gun in their home that was given to them for keeping by the government, and in many cases a handgun. But yet those aren't counted in these numbers because the government technically owned those guns. In Israel, the Small Arms Survey says there's only 7 guns per 100 people. Right? And I'm just going to skip through this pretty quickly. And you can see that, this is the type of graph that you very frequently see that shows gun ownership and gun deaths. I'm not going to really have time, it looks like, to go through all this, but there are real problems with gun ownership. How should you measure gun ownership? Should it be number of guns per 100 people? Let me give you an example. If I have a country where 1% of the population owns 100 guns each, or I have 100% of the people own 1 gun each, those are pretty different. I mean, probably once you get past your 15th gun, it really doesn't affect your ability to use a gun defensively, but maybe going from 0 to 1 gun might make a big difference. And you would think you maybe would rather measure this in terms of percent of guns. Brazil, which I showed you, which has a homicide rate that's about 6 times higher than the US, they actually have only 0.2% of the population is legally licensed to own a gun. The Small Arms Survey would say they have about 16 guns per 100 people. They're not even included in this. But you can see if you have countries like that where you'd have very high homicide rates and low gun ownership, that would actually tend to make this look more negative. And I'm not going to go through this too much, but you can see the relationship here with homicides. This is in gun ownership. If you just take the United States out, you actually get a very slight, not statistically significant negative relationship. If you include the United States and include the other high homicide countries, they're normally ignored. You get a negative relationship. And I'm just going to, whoops. Okay. Could we fix this? Okay. I'm just going to skip ahead and show you a video here for a second.
You've probably heard that America has the most mass shootings in the world. That's often given as a reason for more gun control. But economist John Lott looked into that claim, and he says it's a myth based on one bogus study.
The United States has the most mass shootings.
By far, the most public mass shootings.
You don't see murder on this kind of scale with this kind of frequency in any other advanced nation on earth.
Where'd that claim come from? Obama and everyone else base it on.
A study done by University of Alabama professor Adam Lankford.
University of Alabama professor Adam Lankford.
This is Adam Lankford.
I studied 171 countries for more than 40 years, 1966 to 2012. And essentially the answer was, not surprisingly, the United States has by far the most public mass shooters.
His claim received coverage in hundreds of news stories, but all these people were misled by Lankford. Lankford's study claimed that since 1966, there were 90 mass public shooters in the United States, more than any other country. Lankford counted 202 shooters in the rest of the world. Lankford claimed complete data were available for 171 countries. But how did Lankford find every shooting in all these countries, most of which don't speak English?
And how did he find all the cases in the years before the internet? Few governments collect this data. Finding complete data for mass public shootings in just one developing country, say India in the 1970s, would be an incredible feat. Many of these shootings would have been reported only in local outlets, in the local language.
That shooting at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut.
On the other hand, United States mass public shootings are well documented and hard to miss. If Langford undercounted foreign cases because he missed finding old newspapers or had trouble with language barriers, his paper's entire conclusion that the United States had the most mass public shootings would fall apart. Many journalists and researchers asked Langford for his data. Not only did he refuse to share a list of his cases, or even the number of shootings he found in each country, which are nowhere in his paper, he refused to share an explanation for how he found those cases. That's academic malpractice. Asked if he used foreign languages to search for these shootings, Langford stated, "My data were not limited to English language searches." Asked what languages he used, Langford refused to provide that information. "This is all the assistance I can provide at this time," Langford said. Look, I've researched crime for decades, and I've published dozens of peer-reviewed academic articles on the subject. Langford won't even respond to my emails with simple questions. Now, maybe he doesn't want to talk to me because I'm well known for my research, more guns, less crime. But Langford has refused to share his list of shooters and methods, even with strong gun control advocates. This all seemed very suspicious to me. So the think tank that I run, the Crime Prevention Research Center, researched it. Unlike Langford, we took a lot of time to find all the foreign cases we could. We even got translators to identify cases. Using the same definition of mass public shooters Langford used, 4 more people killed in a public place, not part of some other type of crime, we found that he grossly undercounted foreign attacks. We counted well over 3,000 shooters, at least 15 times more shooters as Langford claimed.
31% of total shooters, despite the fact that we only have 5% of the world's population.
Of the 86 countries where we have identified any mass public shootings occurring, the United States ranks 62nd. Norway, Finland, Switzerland, and Russia are European countries with significantly higher rates of murders from mass public shootings.
The explanation is firearm ownership rate.
When Langford's data are fixed, there is no relationship between gun ownership rates and mass public shooters. There's a lesson here. Langford's critical but simple error could have been picked up if journalists had only demanded his data and methods before publicizing his study. Journalists should learn to be skeptical. In the meantime, we should all be skeptical of news coverage of studies like this that simply confirm what journalists and people want to hear.
Before releasing this video, I also asked Langford for his data and methods for finding shootings in foreign language media. Langford would not provide the information.
Yeah, so that was for data up through 2012. We've since updated it up through 2017. How many people are from France here? How many people are from France here? You know, in 1 year, 2015, France had more casualties from mass public shootings, 532, than the United States had during the entire 8 years of the Obama presidency. But, you know, the thing is, a lot of the attacks in the rest of the world don't get news coverage. You know, people know about the New Zealand attack, but do you know that within 24 hours of that, there was a school shooting in Brazil, and then there was another attack in the Netherlands? You know, these things may get mentioned in the back of the newspaper in the United States or in many other countries, but they don't get the type of attention that U.S. attacks do, and I think it creates a real misimpression in people's minds. Here's just some updated data, the relationship between the number of people killed per 100, and this is even using the small arms survey measure of gun ownership, and this is number of people killed per 100,000, removing a couple of the extreme cases that are there. Anyway, I appreciate your time. You can find more at our website at crimeresearch.org, but I greatly appreciate your time. Thank you very much.